democracy looks like. C-SPAN, powered by cable.
Washington Journal continues.
This morning, we're going to turn our attention to the role of Black voters in Campaign 2024. Joining us this morning is Cliff Albright. He is the co-founder and executive director of Black Voters Matter Fund. What is your group, Cliff Albright?
We are first and foremost, good morning, Greta. We are first and foremost a power building organization. We focus on building power in Black communities, and we know that elections and the vote are one important way of doing that, although not the only way. And so we do work in up to 25 states across the country, talking to Black voters, organizing around our issues, encouraging us to turn out, giving us the tools that we need so that we can turn out, and so that everybody we touch can spread the word to other friends and families and people they like and people they don't like, but just trying to get as many people as possible in the process.
How are you supported?
We get donations from a range of sources, from large foundations, from small foundations, family foundations that maybe nobody's really heard of. But we also get a lot of individual donations, those online small donor gifts. So we get it from a range of sources, and theoretically from people that all believe that Black voters actually matter.
How do Black voters view the president's handling of some key issues? Let's start with the economy.
Yeah, I think you've got, great question. And I think anytime we hear that question, the first thing we have to say, well, which Black voters, right? Because contrary to popular belief, we're not a monolith, right? We do have a lot of beliefs in common. It's been well documented that any given election, between around 90% of our community and our voters will vote a certain way. But it's because of a range of issues. What you hear younger Black voters, what you hear Black male voters talking about, what you hear Black women voters talking about. There'll often be like in a range of similar issues. But so when we talk about the economy, you've got some that say, hey, Black unemployment is the lowest that it's been ever, right? You've got some that say, we're seeing different things coming out of, whether it's the CHIP Act or the infrastructure bill or others. Gas prices going down, but then you've also got some that are very frustrated, that recognize that, well, we've still got very high housing costs, particularly in a lot of the cities and a lot of areas where Black voters live. And so you've got a kind of mixed range, but also what we recognize is related to the economy is to what extent are we able to further our economic futures? To what extent are we able to consider issues of like diversity, equity, inclusion? And so when you see attacks coming from one side that are outright trying to keep you from getting economic advancement, keep you from being able to get contracts, keep us from being able to get to a position of racial justice and economic justice and racial equity, then it becomes clear that at the end of the day, it's not a referendum about whether or not we like what this person or this party in office has done. This is a choice between those that, may sometimes fight and fall short, and those who fundamentally are being anti-Black in their policies.
Related to the economy and jobs is debate over immigration. Republicans this weekend, along with a group of Democratic and Republican senators, talking with the White House about possible changes to immigration policy. You said that it's not a monolithic group, but if you can talk in general, how do Black voters view immigration in our border?
Yeah, again, it's a tricky subject, right? Because it depends on geography, right? Like how Black voters in, say, Texas view it might be slightly different than how Black voters in New York or heck, even Georgia, right, where I'm sitting right now. And so, part of it depends on that. It also depends on, the education and economic well-being, right? So all of those things factor into how we think about immigration. But I think overall, the Black community tends to be, fairly progressive in terms of how we view immigration, in part because, we got to remember not all of these immigrants that we're talking about are immigrants that are Latinx or coming from Mexico. The common perception that we have of immigration caught up in all of this. You've got Haitian immigrants, you've got African immigrants, and in case we forget it, guess what? People like the former twice impeached president remind you, as he did the other night, like, oh, you got all these people coming from these African countries. And so, so it's a fairly complex and nuanced discussion because it's a discussion that not only is about other people coming, but it's also about, about black folks coming from predominantly black nations. But apart from that, just in general of how we tend to view, immigration issues is that, we respect any group of people that's trying to do whatever they can to better their lives, to get to more freedom and economic justice and opportunity, or in some cases, even escaping, political violence. And so, we tend to be fairly progressive when it comes to immigration. It's not the boogeyman issue that Republicans have been able to use it for in other communities.
Black Voters in Campaign 2024 is our conversation this morning. Cliff Albright is our guest, co-founder and executive director of Black Voters Matter Fund. Here's how you can join the conversation. Black voters dial in at 202-748-8000. All others this morning, 202-748-8001. Cliff Albright, what policy decisions, laws specifically impact Black populations in this country?
Yeah, I mean, clearly we've got a discussion going on about a range of issues that directly impact the Black community, right? Like I said, the discussions around diversity, equity, inclusion, the Supreme Court decision around affirmative action, like you've got things like that. You've also got very obviously one of the issues that we fight around and organize around, which is the issue of voting rights and voter suppression, right? Which in this country has always been squarely focused on limiting the rights and abilities and the vote of the Black community. And so, that's one that we are particularly following and interested in, and we often have conversation with folks about. You've got issues around police violence, right? Coming out of 2020, we're still looking for federal legislation that deals more squarely with police accountability. There was a lot of discussion around the George Floyd Act, and that didn't go anywhere, in part because of filibustering and shenanigans from conservatives. But that's an issue that we want to see more action on. Although we have seen administration action, particularly from the Department of Justice, which has been very aggressive at holding local jurisdictions accountable and consent decrees. Just want to really highlight the work that Kristen Clark and the Office of Civil Rights there has been doing on those issues. But we need federal legislation, and that's an issue that we hear Black folks talking about. You hear talk, especially among younger Black voters, around reparations, right? So you got all of these issues that deal squarely directly with our community. But then you've got some of these other issues that are being dealt with and talked about that also impact us. Healthcare impacts the Black community, right? Abortion rights impact the Black community, not only in terms of like maternal health, keeping in mind that Black women have maternal mortality rates that are often 4 or 5 times that of white maternal mortality rates, but as we continue to hear about the criminalization of women, the profiling of women traveling state to state, that is also very much a criminal justice and even an economic issues for the Black community and for Black families. So all of these issues, healthcare, abortion rights, the Inflation Reduction Act, climate change, all of these issues impact the Black community as well as other people, but in many ways, disproportionately impact the Black community.
What level of support did President Biden receive from Black voters in 2020, and has that changed as we head into 2024?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because when we talk about level of support, right, it's a combination of a couple of things. It's level of support in terms of like actual turnout, right, and the ways that Black voters voted, and in that sense, the president got, again, not as much as President Obama, but still we're talking about 90% support, right? And in the case of Black women, over 90% of support. But you also got to think about like what is the level of enthusiasm for that vote. And I think one of the things that people missed in 2020 is that while Black voters were very clear about which candidate we supported, again, we're talking about 90% support, but how deep was that enthusiasm? And so when you look at some of the recent polls that people have been, shouting about and thinking, oh, the sky is falling, which it's not. but it certainly is drizzling a little bit when you think about like black enthusiasm for President Biden. And the thing that I've been reminding people is that that's not necessarily a big change from 2020 when we weren't enthusiastic about that support, but we were very pragmatic about that support. We were very pragmatic about the electability issues. And so here we are now in the middle of an administration where you're seeing these concerns, but in many ways, these recent polls, which again, the sky is not falling, but in many ways, these recent polls are simply exposing something that really existed even going back to 2020. And I believe that as we get closer to 24, that you'll see some of those numbers changing to whatever extent those numbers are even accurate right now, which again, I'm very skeptical of.
Before we get to calls, the New York Times with this headline this morning, trying to get black men to back Biden. From the article, several attendees said there was general agreement that Mr. Biden, during both his 2020 campaign and his first 3 years in office, had paid more attention to black female voters than to black male ones. These people said they had suggested to Mr. Biden's aides that the president needed to make a specific argument about how his administration had improved the lives of black men. Let's talk to our viewers. Maria in Atlanta, Georgia, a black voter. Hi, Maria. Good morning. Welcome to the conversation.
Good morning, Greta and Albright and the C-SPAN family. As an African-American woman, first, I would like to say I will never, ever vote. If I had to vote Republican, I would never vote. I don't understand that for the life of me. And number two, we do have a lot of issues, but I would say that's our fault because we do not fight hard enough. We really don't. I see other races, they fight hard, they get what they want. And number two, I hear a lot, number three, and last, I hear a lot of African Americans complain about Joe Biden. And I feel for some of the things that he has passed, a lot of people don't even know what he has passed. They didn't complain about President Obama this much, the way they complain about Biden. And that's all I really got to say. Thank you and have a good day.
Yeah, Maria, we'll take those comments. Cliff Albright.
Yeah, I'll take the last part first about, the things that have been done. And certainly in the conversation, whenever we have conversations with voters on this topic, we do point out like the things that have been done about some of the historic legislation. Look, I wasn't a big Joe Biden fan during the 2000 primaries, right? But we can't ignore the fact that the first couple of years, the first 3 years of this administration have been like historic in terms of legislation passed. I mean, we're talking about the biggest investment in climate change ever. We're talking about, the CHIPS Act. We're talking about, although nowhere near what we need on gun violence, the fact that anything related to gun violence actually passed. And again, this is an issue that black voters care about, particularly younger black voters. I mean, so when we just look at the range of issues that where we've seen action, there's actually been a lot done. With that said, though, when people talk to us about the shortcomings, about the issues that they wanted to see more on, whether it is police accountability or voting rights or some of the other issues, we can't ignore that either. And so we've got to have a balanced conversation where we point out to people, look, folks, stuff has been done. And if we want more done, then we've got to come out and vote even more, both at the presidential level as well as at the congressional level, for people that are willing to get these policies passed and are not actually running on the opposite, which is running on anti-blackness.
John in D.C. Good morning to you, John.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to hear that we have Black Voters Matter. I'm the chairman of what's called Black Wealth Matters. We are a organization that focuses on one thing, payment for the injury of slavery to black people in the United States of America. The word reparations, I need to bring this up to you, sir. That is a taxpayer responsibility. That's why we have not received any form of payment for the injury. And there's also a warfare or military action implication. The correct legal definition of our injury is called slavery compensation. It does not go into the taxpayer's pocket. It goes directly to the 82 actors that are still around today, making lots of money, okay? And they are ready to pay. I've met with a few. There's no pushback, but they just don't want to go down the reparations trail. And also, the presidents. Everybody loves Barack Obama, and I think that's a great, I should say, a feeling to have to see a non-descendant American as the president of the United States. I'm sorry, a non-descendant enslaved American. He had no ties to slavery. His administration did not really embrace the idea of reparations. George Bush Sr., he tried by getting Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court, and what a plop.
All right, John,
Okay,
I'm going to get reaction from Cliff Albright. Do you have a question for him?
Here's the question. Which one do you prefer, reparations or slavery compensation? One pays $35,000 for 400 years of slavery. Slavery compensation pays $1.8 million per descendant in this country. And I'll listen to your response off there.
Well, thank you for the question, and as I was saying, Greta, right, that there's a significant portion of the Black community that cares about this reparations issue. I'll say this, in terms of which word you say tomato, I'll say tomatoes. It's about what you got into, which is what does it actually look like? And one of the things that we've been doing, both at the federal level as well as at the local level, is calling for reparations, calling for study commissions, again, at all levels. And I agree completely with what the caller said about, like, it's got to go beyond just the government payments. Yes, there are other insurance companies, there are banks, there's a range of companies that still are benefiting from the legacy of slavery. That's why when some states have passed policies that have required certain types of companies to reveal their connections to it, we support that process. We at Black Voters Matter, we started a reparations fund to invest in local communities that are trying to get local policies, because there's a role that can be played at the city and state level as well. So I agree with the caller that there's a lot of actors that need to be involved in discussion. There's federal legislation that we need. And short of that, we can actually even have a presidential study committee, right? Because HR 40 calls for a congressional study committee, but we could have an executive level, an administration level study committee. So we are big supporters of this discussion, this process, and we've actually invested time and resources into it.
Shirley in Orangeburg, South Carolina. Hi, Shirley.
Hi, Greta and Mr. Albright. I just really want to make a comment. Me personally, I vote Democrat all the time, ever since Dr. King and all the other blacks, and everybody knew who I'm talking about, bled and died for me to have the right to vote. And I get out and I vote every time it's a voting thing come up. And I would never vote for a Democrat. And Donald Trump, never. I lived in New York over 40-some years, and I know Donald Trump when he first came on the scene. This man is a disgrace to the United States of America, and I would never vote for him.
All right.
Thank you all, and have a good day.
All right. Shirley says she'll never vote for him. Take a look at this poll. A Gen Forward survey based at the University of Chicago polled 3,448 eligible voters nationally online in November. Black voters in campaign 2024, 63% said that they would vote for President Biden. 20% said they wanted to vote for someone else, and 17% said that they would vote for the former president. Cliff Albright, what do you make of those numbers, and are you concerned?
I wouldn't say that I'm concerned about it, right? Not ignoring it, but not necessarily concerned, or at least not as concerned as what others have made it out to be. You mentioned the article right before we went to the callers talking about the black male percentages. Look, we've been hearing these numbers of like what Trump is going to get, what Republican candidates are going to get, and particularly targeting black men. We've been hearing these numbers now for years, ever since 16, right? And then repeated throughout 20 and 22. They've been telling us that Trump would get 20%. That particular poll says 17%. It hasn't happened yet, right? It didn't happen in 16. It didn't happen in 20. They went out in Georgia and found Herschel Walker. They dug him up from wherever he was in Texas and found him to run in Georgia because they figured, let's get a black male who played football and won a Heisman and will come running to this. It didn't happen. He didn't get our votes. You recently, just a few months ago, you had Daniel Cameron, not a few months ago, 1 month ago, you had Daniel Cameron running, Republican in Kentucky. He also happened to be the attorney general that refused to prosecute the police officers that killed Breonna Taylor. But they said he's a black male, he's Republican, he's conservative, he'll get 20%. It didn't happen. And so I take all of these polls with a grain of salt. Now, with that said, does that mean that we can afford to ignore them completely, to not communicate with black voters and not communicate with black males in particular? No, we can't afford that because at the end of the day, the other side, Trump and others, are viewing this gender gap and they're viewing that there's some space where they can target certain voters, black males, younger black voters, right? We know that there's a lot of disinformation targeted to younger black voters in 2016 and 2020, some of which even came from Russia. This isn't conspiracy. This is what we know about the misinformation that was out there. And so we know that some segments of our community are being targeted with misinformation and disinformation, and that can have an impact on the margins. So it's not something that we need to panic about, but it is something that we need to take a look at, and we need to make sure that we are communicating with all the segments of the black community in ways that are most effective. And that's why trusted messengers like our organization and other organizations that are on the ground talking to folks every day, that's why it's important that we be resourced enough so that we can have the kind of accurate communications that needs to take place with our community.
Dan Balls, a veteran political observer, writing in his piece in the Washington Post for today, the Sunday Take, young voters lack enthusiasm for Biden, but he will need them. And he notes that young voters, especially young black and Hispanic Americans, have shown signs of unease toward the president. He notes that nothing is assured. The number of younger people who turned out in 2024 and the number of them who support Biden over the former president, if Donald Trump is the Republican nominee, will help decide the overall outcome. In states such as Georgia, Wisconsin, and Arizona, which in 2020 were decided by only a few thousand votes, young voters are critically important to Biden's hopes of carrying them again. Ray in Pleasant View, Tennessee. Hi, Ray.
Yes, thank you for taking my call. First of all, I would like to say about this Hispanic American, African American, this is the United States of Americans. That we have had the problem in this country underlying, and then when President Obama became the president, he accelerated it. The division of people. If we don't get back together where we're the Americans, we're all in this together, and we're not looking for special handouts and all that, this country is going to fall. It's predicted. You can hear it in the way people are talking nowadays.
All right, Ray, let's get a reaction to what you said. Cliff Albright.
Well, it always tickles me when people, cite President Obama as the start of issues with racial justice or, the caller might be surprised to learn about this thing called the Civil War. You might be surprised to learn that there's been hundreds of years of history of racial strife. W.B. Du Bois told us in the early 1900s that the problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line. That was way before Barack Obama. And guess what? Professor Du Bois was absolutely correct. And we're still dealing with it. And so, we've obviously we got a lot of issues around seeking racial justice. And we can't get there by ignoring it. We can't get there by being colorblind. We can't get there by acting like it all started with President Obama.
Jay's in Texas. Jay, a black voter in Texas. What are your thoughts this morning?
Yes. Thank you to Washington Journal and the host and Mr. Albright. I have a few points and I have a question at the end. And my question at the end is, with all the entities that we have, black entities that we have that are fighting for economic and equal justice for black people, why can't there be a coalition of all to get together in power? But my statement is, since America was here, it has been really just a bad place as far as the economic strife, slavery, and all of the other above. And that happened with Europeans coming over here. and they were immigrants, but we want to tackle the immigration issues of today with everybody coming in from on the outside, and that seems like that's just unfair. I know that we can't go back to the beginning with reparations or anything like that because that would be billions, if not trillions of dollars. So they can't even, they don't even want to have that conversation in all fairness. But I'm 65 years old, and I've seen nothing but a disunited States, not a United States of America, but I've seen the disruption of America each and every year, and it's just getting worse. So I hope that there will be a conversation with Mr. Albright on trying to get coalition of all the black entities that are in America to come together as one voice, to put all of their resources together as one voice and fight this fight. If not, we're going down a slippery slope in America, and we're going down fast.
All right, Jay, let's get a reaction from Cliff Albright.
Yeah, I really want to encourage the caller, right? And I hear everything you're saying about, this long history that we're talking about. But, there is progress being made in that area that you talked about and asked about in terms of coalition. I want to guarantee you that there's a large number of organizations that are in coalition on a daily basis. A big part of how we do our work at Black Voters Matter is that we are in coalition, not even with the types of national orgs that you're talking about, although we do that as well, but we're in partnership with over 600 organizations that we have been talking to, supporting. We re-grant to local organizations that don't get resources from almost any other place, 600 across the country, totaling $36 million over the past 6 years. That's coalition building with smaller and local groups. We do the same thing with state level organizations and with national organizations. We're in coalitions that fought with us all throughout 2021 and still to this day on this issue of voting rights. I got arrested 5 times in 2021, not by myself, but with folks from hundreds of other organizations, including some from the legacy black organizations that we often talk about. And so I just want to encourage the caller to know that there are coalitions, there is unity taking place, but we got to be clear, the folks that we are working against or who are working against us, they are also in coalition. And so sometimes their efforts, right, this is not a thing where we can just analyze our progress just off of what we do, because the reality is that we have opposition. There is an opposing force that we're up against. So sometimes, even when it seems we may not be moving the ball very far, it's not necessarily because of inherent weaknesses of our organizing. Sometimes it's just the nature of the opposition and the times that we're in.
We're going to go to Syracuse, New York. James, question or comment?
Yeah, I think your guest is concerned about the wrong issues. How about the 70% of black babies that are born to single mothers, black-on-black crime in Chicago? But I do agree on abortion rights. I think more black women should have access to abortions. It would reduce the future prison population.
Let's move on to
Please, thank you.
To Dorothy in Maryland. Dorothy.
Yes. First of all, I would give Congress a big fat 0 because they are so messy, and I don't think, and I would like to see them called out for the NRA, whereas who is getting funded from the NRA that's keeping these guns out here and killing our kids. I would like to see them to be pointed out, because we're not going to get rid of these guns that are killing our kids until they change their ways.
All right, Dorothy there in Maryland. Cliff Albright?
Yeah, I think, thank you, Dorothy. I think, she models what I mentioned earlier, right? That black voters are very passionate about this issue of gun safety. And that includes older black voters of all ages, but in particular, younger black voters, like most younger voters altogether. Again, keeping in mind that we've got a whole generation that has now become the first generation that spent their entire school years doing gun safety drills and hiding under desks and in closets. And so Black communities are very passionate about this issue, and again, it's one of those issues that we've got to have more action on. And in order to do so, we've got to have a Congress that is not beholden to the NRA, and that's not the situation that we have right now in Congress. So, yeah, that's one of the issues that we talk to folks regularly in order to, motivate folks to see how important it is that we come out and vote at all levels.
Greg, Huntsville, Alabama. Hi, Greg.
Hey, good morning. Hey, yeah, I hear what he's saying here. Your guest, I'm sorry, your name slips my mind. That's rude of me. It's
Cliff
early
Albright.
here in Huntsville, Alabama.
That's all right. Cliff Albright.
Well, I hear what you're saying, sir, and appreciate your passion for what you're doing. But I hear Democrat talking points. That's sort of an assumption. Black vote's a Democrat talking point from what I'm hearing. It's not really I didn't hear a single topic there that I thought, man, that sounds like it's just down the middle of the road. It just seemed like a Democratic talking point. But neither here nor there. I'd love to hear more about solutions. We're talking about, black vote. I think it's the most racist thing I've ever heard to say that someone can't produce a photo ID in 4 years when you're in a country that we could put our concentrated effort into protecting our democracy by making sure everyone has an ID and they are who they are when they say they vote. And that goes for everybody. That's Republican, Democrat. I don't trust any of them at the polls. I think both parties have a potential in some areas that they might cheat or put their thumb on the scale. And that whenever we have that question in our head, I think it hurts our democracy. We could do a lot better job with that.
Okay,
And
Greg,
so
let's take your point. Let's take your point about IDs.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. I think one of the things we often come across is when we talk about voting rights and voter suppression, people want to jump straight to the issue of voter IDs. Like that's the only form of voter suppression that we're talking about. We're talking about laws in this country that, and practices in this country that, have unfairly targeted black voters, purged us from voter lists, held on to our registration forms, closing polling places in our community, eliminating drop boxes in our community. I mean, there's just a range of making it illegal to give out food and water for people on long lines, which in fact are caused by state action that cause those long lines in black communities. And so, it's convenient when folks want to focus on just the issue of photo ID, which in and of itself is problematic. I'll remind the caller that in the state of Alabama, when a few years ago, when they passed their photo ID law, simultaneously, they closed all of the Department of Motor Vehicles in the black belt counties where most of the black voters lived, which would have enabled them to be able to get their photo IDs. So we act as if these photo IDs policies are in isolation, but they are often done in tandem with other actions that they know are going to make it harder for black voters and other types of voters, low income voters, black, brown voters, younger voters, making it easier to be able to get registered using your gun license, but not your college ID, right? And so it's not just like this random notion of, oh, we need people to have photos. It's part of a very strategic pattern that is designed to make it harder for certain voters to vote. But, again, it's not just about photo ID. It's about the range of other issues. It's about the gerrymandering that we see taking place in states like Alabama and Louisiana and South Carolina and Georgia and others, right? So there's a range of issues, and it's very convenient when people just want to talk about photo ID.
Let's go to Carl in Manhattan. Hi, Carl.
Good morning, Mr. Albright.
Morning.
The situation is real crazy, man. See, they're going back to the old laws from 1700 and coming forward. They have no future, but because they're all Confederate. That's one thing. I vote every year, president and other little things. But what I want to say to you, sir, get the book, 400-Year Holocaust, by Dante King. Thank you.
I'll look for it.
All right, we'll go to Bob, who's in Eagle River, Wisconsin. Bob?
Good morning. I just had a few comments. I mean, as far as history goes, the Democratic Party they didn't vote any votes to free the slaves or equal rights for slaves, anything like that. It was always the Republicans. And then also, drop boxes boxes, ballot harvesting, no IDs. I know a bunch of black people. I mean, they're my friends. I don't know any black people that work that don't have an ID to cash their check, buy alcohol, do anything. I don't think IDs are a big problem for black people. I don't see your point in that, and only American citizens should vote, and that would take an ID, and black people have IDs? I don't get it. Thank you for your time. You guys are wonderful.
Cliff Albright, your response?
Well, to that caller, I'll just say, see my previous response to the other caller about how people conveniently want to focus on photo ID and ignore the whole spectrum of voter suppression that takes place on a range of issues. So I'm hoping that the caller is as concerned about racial gerrymandering and about all these other issues and the closing of polling places. I guess he's okay with drop boxes being eliminated from communities in spite of the fact that it's been proven to be safe and effective. So, again, I'll just refer that caller to my answer to the previous caller.
Sankofa, I think I'm saying that name correctly, in Marietta, Georgia.
Yes, good morning.
Morning.
And first of all, I want to start out saying that I am a descendant of the enslaved, and we were not immigrants. We were kidnapped. We were branded, and we were put in the bottom of a ship and brought to this country against our will. We are not immigrants, and I get tired of everybody saying that we are all immigrants. No, we're not. There's two groups of people that are not immigrants. It's my descendants of the enslaved and indigenous. We are not immigrants. Secondly, as a black person, that I believe that we as a black group should not be just giving our vote to one party blindly. They should have to compete for our vote. If you're not offering us anything, you're not getting our vote. And we're learning that. We've been sitting up there voting blue no matter who, and we get nothing for our vote. We are tired of symbolism. We want specifics. And as far as reparation, we're tired of this talk about we're going to study. You don't need to study. You didn't have to study the hate group. I mean the law that for the Asians, the hate group, the law for Asians. You didn't have to study that. They also got reparations. But when it comes to us, you want to give us this crap about we not a study. No, we don't need a study. We need to get our check. Thank you.
Cliff Albright?
Yeah, I'll start with the earlier point that the caller made about, giving our votes blindly to one party. Let me be clear. Black folks have never given our vote blindly to just one party. We've always been very pragmatic, and we've looked at how are we going to get the results that we want. When Dr. King called in 1957, we talk about Selma in 65, but he gave a speech in 1957 talking about give us the ballot. And he said, give us the ballot. He went through a range of issues that he said, if you give us these ballots, we can get movement on these issues. So it's never just been about just getting a vote without it being connected to issues. And it's never been about just supporting one party blindly without, thinking about the issues. When black voters shifted from the Republican Party, right? Because one of your callers, at least historically, was correct in terms of the early days of Jim Crow and Civil War and Reconstruction. Black voters voted Republican to the extent that we could vote, for decades. When we shifted our votes, it was because of changes that we saw in policy, starting with the New Deal policies and then coming with the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. It was policy that led us to shift, not just blind allegiance. In fact, it was policy that caused us to shift from one party to another party. And today, if any kind of shift is going to take place, it's got to be based on the same thing. Republicans actually could have some inroads with black voters on specific issues, whether it's economic issues or even in some communities, some cultural conservative issues. They could have inroads if they backed up their disinformation with actual policy that would benefit our communities, but they don't. In fact, they do the opposite. and they run on anti-blackness. Keep in mind, there was a whole discussion about student debt cancellation where Republicans came out against the president specifically because they were upset that such debt cancellation would improve economic fairness for black debt holders, right? So they're not even hiding the anti-blackness. So it's not about just blind loyalty. It is about policy. It has always been about policy. It's about which side is actually trying to advance diversity, equity, inclusion, and affirmative action, and which side is actively running against those things. That is policy. So it's not about, blind allegiance. Our voting actions are always very pragmatic, and it's based on which issues and which candidates are favoring the issues that we care about.
All right. Deed Rickson, Covington, Louisiana.
Yes, how you doing today?
Morning.
I was just calling about, I lived in Chicago for 50 years, and our black politicians, we have voted for different presidents, and the outcome have been the same. Crime have increased in the black community tremendously. And blacks in Chicago, blacks in Chicago, they live in their homes in fear. They can't come out in their community at night. They can't walk the streets anymore in the community. They can't go to the parks. And we have voted for black politicians, but it seems like they're afraid to speak out on the crimes that is in the black community.
Okay, Deed, Rick, we'll take that point. Cliff Albright.
Yeah, again, thank you for the question. Be clear, black communities and black voters are very concerned about issues of safety. Part of the challenges that we've had is that we've often confused safety with policing. We've been led to believe that policing is the only way to get to safety, when in actuality, there's a range of things that make our communities more safe. And some of it deals with issues like economic justice and housing and education and healthcare. And so I think the caller is right that this is a significant issue that our communities think about. I think it would be wrong to say that whatever has or has not happened is just a function of black, quote unquote, black politicians, right? Because the reality is that there's a range of issues that impact our local safety within cities. Many of the cities that are often criticized are cities that are embedded in red states. And it's those very policies by conservative governors or legislatures that impact our ability, even when you talk about, or you talk about Chicago, and, you got to keep in mind when you're talking about gun violence, that oftentimes you've got guns from surrounding states that are controlled by other elected officials, conservative, Republican, if you will, that is impacting the safety within a city like Chicago. And so it's a range of issues that are controlled not just by like the mayors and the city councils. Being a mayor of a city is one of the most difficult jobs in the country, in part because you've got so many other layers of government that impact how effective you can be at that level. So there's a range of issues, but certainly I agree with the caller that we've got to do more in terms of safety issues in our communities. In saying that, though, we also need to be realistic and look at like what have the stats actually said about crime and safety in the direction that has been going in for years. And even to that point, I think that there's been a certain amount of hyperbole about some of the increases. It doesn't mean it's not an issue. It doesn't mean our voters don't care about it, but it does mean that there's been a boogeyman that's been put out there, including from people like Trump, talking about how we need to send federal troops to Chicago. That kind of misinformation only makes the problem worse.
Cliff Albright is the co-founder and executive director of Black Voters Matter Fund. You can find more information if you go to blackvotersmatterfund.org or on X with the handle @BlackVotersMTR. Cliff Albright, I want to thank you for the conversation this morning with our viewers. I also want to apologize for the viewer and their comments earlier, the offensive remarks that were made. We don't certainly condone that. I want to make that clear to you and our viewers. So I apologize for those offensive remarks. We want to have a civil conversation here, and for the most part, we do. So thank you, sir, and apologies.
No apology necessary. Thank you so much. It's a part of the discourse, unfortunately, that's happening in the country. But thank you so much for that thought.
Cliff Albright. Again, you can find more if you go to blackvotersmatterfund.org. We're going to take a break.